The Prime Minister is asking Canadians for patience. He's also warning against the use of force to end the protests that have stopped trains in much of this country. But his government's strategy to use dialogue is under increasing pressure from the opposition, as we saw yesterday, both in question period and in an emergency debate last night in the Commons.
It's exactly this do-nothing approach that has created the crisis we face today. It's time for the Liberals to tell Canadians how they will lead for all of Canada, restore the rule of law, and end these illegal blockades.
Hear, hear. This will not be the first time that Canadians have called for police action, even military action. Communication is the only way forward. Good faith negotiation is what the Wet'suwet'en are asking for.
Indigenous peoples have been backed into a corner. We've heard numbers, we've heard figures, we've heard contributions to economic development, but I'm on the ground and I know it's failing. It's not working for Indigenous peoples or groups.
We all know what needs to be done. We have known for decades, but we are here yet again in a moment of crisis because this hard work has been punted.
Some of the moments, some of the voices from that emergency debate last night in the House of Commons. The last voice, of course, you recognize Jody Wilson-Raybould. I am definitely going to come back to her in just one moment. I want to bring in our national affairs editor, Chris Hall, who's been paying close attention to this issue and joins me this morning trying to bring some perspective to what is happening in Ottawa. Chris, great to see you this morning, and thank you for being here. The Prime Minister, Chris, remains committed to this strategy of dialogue and negotiation. We heard last night at that emergency debate from Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller saying the government is looking at a suite of options. From what you are hearing behind the scenes, what is happening? What are viable options at this point for the government?
Well, there are not very many at this point, other than what we've been hearing consistently from the Prime Minister about this is going to take time to have this dialogue, that this dispute over the Wet'suwet'en and the Coastal GasLink pipeline and the protests that have popped up in support of that position are part of a larger problem around reconciliation. So that's the approach they're taking. There are some suggestions that there must be or should be continued talks at the Deputy Minister level with Wet'suwet'en and other Indigenous leaders. I'm not sure how far along those might be. There was a call last night between Carolyn Bennett, the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, but still no promise of a meeting, which really comes back to the main point that we're hearing from the Wet'suwet'en in particular, is that they would like the RCMP off of their traditional territory. That's complicated. It would imply, at least to the opponents of the government, that they're not in charge of these discussions, that it's the hereditary chiefs and their supporters who are in charge, and that's not a good look. But the other thing, of course, is that it's difficult to pick up the phone and tell Brenda Lucki, the RCMP commissioner, to remove these officers from the area, or to ask John Horgan, the BC Premier, because the RCMP is under contract with the province there. So you get my point. It's very complicated to actually do that. So that I don't think at this point is a serious consideration.
Although it was interesting, from Carolyn Bennett and from Mark Miller seem to be slightly different interpretations about whether that is even being considered at this point, whether to make that ask. You know, you would understand the sensitivity given the history in Canada. People have referenced it so often during these, during the coverage of this, during our focus on this, Oka and Ipperwash and Caledonia and all of that past. And the Prime Minister continues to call for patience. But for how long, Chris?
Well, this is the real key, right? I'm talking to a number of people who both are inside the government, but also Liberal MPs who will be holding their caucus meeting later today. They understand that reconciliation requires, goodwill from the public, that the public support. And the longer this dispute drags on, the more that difficult it becomes to get propane, if that's how you heat your home and cook your food in rural areas of this country, or to get to work because passenger trains are being blocked. The less likely it is there's going to be public support for the reconciliation process. So it's a kind of a vicious circle. Yes, it will take time, but there's not a lot of time left. In most of the estimations of the people I've talked to, they think that there's really, until the end of the week, there has to be some progress. The trains have to start moving again, or they risk losing that public support for the dialogue that the Prime Minister is talking about.
It seems that among those who've already lost patience are the premiers of the country, or at least some of them anyway. Scott Moe calling for a conference call today of his premier colleagues and territorial leaders. How do you see the premiers coming into play on this, Chris?
Well, it's already a difficult relationship with the Prime Minister over a whole bunch of issues, most of them related, obviously, to energy and the oil and gas sector, and this could be really considered to be one of them. For Saskatchewan and Alberta, of course, getting trains moving is really critical, particularly for the grains that are now basically in grain elevators or stockpiled, and they're not moving, and farmers don't get paid until they actually get their stuff on the ships. So there's a concern there, but I think as part of the overarching tension that now exists between the federal and provincial governments, with the more conservative-minded premiers demanding action, really supporting the kind of approach that Andrew Scheer has been talking about, which is end the blockades now, use the police if you need to, which would seem to be the only alternative from their point of view, and get the trains rolling again. So I just think it's an added dimension, another problem for the Prime Minister, who's working very hard to keep the public focused on the real issue, which is reconciliation in his mind, and that these protests can be resolved as long as we are acting in goodwill and have the long-term view. So they look at it as this is a symptom, these protests, of the reconciliation process, whereas obviously if you talk to the Conservatives and to the premiers, it's more of an issue in itself that's getting in the way of any real talk on reconciliation.
And Andrew Scheer, the Conservative leader, certainly made that point very directly yesterday as he spoke in question period. He called Trudeau's statement and the speech he delivered the weakest response to a national crisis in Canadian history. He kept coming back to the protesters, Chris, as radical activists, and then was disqualified from that subsequent leaders' meeting. The Greens were there, the NDP, the Bloc as well, but no Conservative, no Andrew Scheer and all of that. Again, does he make any political headway, or if that part of the story, the weakest response to a national crisis in Canadian history, becomes the real narrative here, what are the political consequences?
Yeah, if the message from Andrew Scheer yesterday was that if this is a national crisis, we need an action plan, I think that was lost once again in the discussion around radical activists and the suggestion that somehow that the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs don't have any real standing in this discussion, because he's really focused on the elected band council, 5 out of the 6 in the Wet'suwet'en territory, who support the Coastal GasLink pipeline. He's focused on the specific event and the results of those protests. If I could, I was interested yesterday, the Prime Minister spoke about populism and speaking only to those people who have the similar view as you, and talking to Andrew Scheer. And at the same time, he excludes Andrew Scheer from a meeting because he doesn't like what he has to say. So there is that dynamic playing out here
irony,
as
really.
well. Yeah, some people would note that's not exactly walking the walk. When you say populism is rearing its head, you need to hear from all sides, and then you exclude the guy because you don't like what he has to say. So look, there's a lot of blame going around here. In the end, I think what matters to Canadians, and having talked to the MPs who are going into caucus today, they're hearing about the concerns about the trains not moving, the impact it's having on the economy, and specifically the impact it's having on the reputation of Canadian producers in grain and anything else, that they cannot get their products to market and customers are left waiting. So ultimately you have these competing interests.
Yes.
How do you reconcile these historic grievances, which have to be dealt with at some point, with the need to get the economy rolling again?
And so, who brings those two sides together? I have to allow time for my question, as promised, on Jody Wilson-Raybould. We saw her there, prominent in the emergency debate. She made public comments yesterday saying that she was open to being the mediator in this issue. Do you see any role for her, given what happened with the party, her relationship with the Prime Minister? Where could we see Jody Wilson-Raybould?
Yeah, I actually called around today to ask that question. I don't think that's on the menu right now, that Carolyn Bennett and Mark Miller are taking the lead and they're trying to negotiate sort of nation to nation, if I can put it that way. That's certainly what the Prime Minister has been referring to. What I heard a lot from MPs is that this was a kind of a similar situation with what happened with Jody Wilson-Raybould when she was ultimately removed from caucus and cabinet, is that it took too long to make a decision. Could she help? I mean, she certainly has a background in Indigenous relations. She certainly herself is Indigenous, and from Vancouver and from British Columbia. So maybe that's an option. I just haven't heard anybody in a position of authority saying that's being considered at this time.
All right. May I assume that this is going to be on the House this weekend?
You can, exactly, and maybe for several weekends
I was going to say,
forward.
This is preoccupying the nation, and rightly so. Chris, thank you so much for this morning, and we'll be listening.